when civilians are more likely to have guns to protect themselves, you actually see criminals being less likely to carry guns themselves.
John Lott is founder and president of Crime Prevention Research Center. He has published, among other books, More Guns, Less Crime, The Bias Against Guns, Dumbing Down the Courts, How Politics Keeps the Smartest Judges Off the Bench, The War on Guns.
Police are the single most important factor for reducing crime. But the police themselves know that they virtually always arrive on the crime scene after the crimes occurred. And that raises the question about what people should do when they're having to confront a criminal by themselves. If having a gun is by far the safest course of action.
John, I want to talk to you about your article that you published called Biden's Gun-First Approach to Violent Crime Ignores Basic Facts. And one of those basic facts, as you point out, is that 92% of violent crimes in America do not involve firearms.
Right. Yeah, I mean, he goes to New York and gives this big speech on reducing violence. And even if his proposals work, they'd only be dealing with 8% of the violent crime that's out there. I mean, I guess I wish he had had kind of a Sister Soldier type coming to Jesus type moment on this thing, where he would have said, look, you have the city council, which has cut $1 billion from the police department. You've had district attorneys in New York City who are refusing to prosecute violent criminals. You've had bail reform there that's letting people out and committing more crimes. I mean, if somebody's facing many years in prison anyway, and they go and commit another crime, what are you going to do? Give them a second life sentence or something that's there? I mean, they have almost no cost for doing that. And you have huge numbers. Over half the inmates have been released from jails there in the New York City area. Is it any difficulty to understand why there's been an increase in violent crime? But Biden didn't address those issues. The only references he made to police and to prosecutors were just solely focused on enforcing gun control laws. And I'll mention one other inconvenient fact, and that is there's so much discussion by Biden about how it's gun crime that's causing the increase in overall violent crime. Well, I mean, violent crime increased in 2000 from 2019, but violent crimes with guns fell by 27%. So, I mean, how can you blame guns for the increase in violent crime when gun crime fell hugely? I mean, I've never seen such a large 1-year drop in gun crime. And that's whether you look at crimes report to police, that's the FBI crime data that everybody points to when they talk about the increase in violent crime, or whether you look at the National Crime Victimization Survey, which surveys about 100,000 people each year. Both of those saw a 27% drop in violent gun crimes.
John, crime going up in other categories, but going down regarding gun crimes. Why is that?
Well, there's a lot of research out there. I've done some. There's others that have done this too, that indicates that when civilians are more likely to have guns to protect themselves, you actually see criminals being less likely to carry guns themselves. Part of that may be if, let's say, somebody's going to carjack a car and they pull out a gun, the person inside there may be more likely to pull out a gun and shoot them than they would if they had some other type of weapon that was there. But it's something that researchers have observed in the past, so it's not particularly surprising. But the size of the drop is just shocking in terms of how large it is, and it's something that you just don't see mentioned at all in the media. You know, you see these stories in the media about, well, there was increased gun sales, big increase in gun sales during the pandemic. I mean, you and I know that the increase in gun sales was due to the increase in violent crime, that people saw that police weren't being allowed to do their jobs, that many of these George Soros prosecutors weren't doing their jobs. I mean, you even have cases of murder where district attorneys like Kim Foxx in Chicago was unwilling to prosecute gang members because initially her office said it was mutually agreed to combat that was there, even though there was a murder and multiple serious injuries. And then they want to go and point out that they said, well, the increase in gun sales must be why violent crime went up and gun crime went up. But gun crime didn't go up. Gun crime fell.
John, speaking of media, I want you to react to this excerpt from Joy Reid. She's a talk show host on MSNBC Hee Haw. I watched, and you don't have to.
All these Republicans who are claiming to be just so concerned about the kids. Ron DeSantis was an incoming freshman congressman when Sandy Hook happened. Where was his concern then? And you know what's tragic, Governor Christie Noem? The kids across the country have no idea what it's like to go to school without the prospect of an active shooter showing up. I, for one, am eagerly awaiting all of your legislative proposals, other than thoughts and prayers, that address this urgent threat to our kids, since you care so much about protecting the children. And I know when you folks want to do something, you do it. Take, for example, these other Republicans who want to trigger the libs. You remember these pictures of Representatives Lauren Boebert and Thomas Massie? How does cosplaying with the weapon of choice of school mass murderers in matching outfits protect the children? I mean, do you leave those firearms just laying around the house where the kids can get to them? And maybe, just maybe, if Republicans cared about the kids, they could muster the courage to pass a new assault weapons ban, just like the one that Joe Biden got passed back in 1994. You know, the assault weapons ban that Republicans allowed to expire. Unfortunately, for actual accountability, parents and kids they're on their own when it comes to school shootings.
John, please respond to anything that Ms. Reid just now said.
Right. Well, there's a lot there. I mean, obviously, you and I have talked about these types of issues for 20 some years. The Crime Prevention Research Center recently came out with a report that looked at all times where firearms have been fired at schools from 2000 through the end of 2018. And one of the things that we found is that any of the schools that have teachers or staff being able to go and carry concealed handguns have not seen one attack where anybody's been injured or killed. All the school shootings have occurred at those places where teachers and staff aren't allowed to go and carry. There are 20 states that allow teachers and staff to be able to go and carry guns. You know, in some states like New Hampshire and Utah, any teacher that has a concealed handgun permit is allowed to carry. In other states, you may have to get the school district approval. But in Texas, you have like 45%, similar percentages in Ohio or Oklahoma of school districts have teachers or staff that carry. So it's way across the country. All sorts of schools have this. And yet there's not been one attack that's occurred anywhere near school hours when teachers and staff have been able to go and carry. And, you know, so she wants to go and ban assault weapons. Wouldn't do anything to go and stop these types of attacks. I want to go do something that matters. And one thing you see with mass public shootings generally, not just with school shootings, is that whether it's Sandy Hook or whether it's these other ones, the common feature in about 94% of these attacks is that they keep on occurring in places where people aren't allowed to defend themselves. If you have one police officer who's in uniform guarding a school, he has an almost impossible job. If somebody's going to go and attack that school, who do you think they attack first? Because they know if they kill that one police officer, they're going to have free reign to go after the other people that are there. And so, it's kind of like the police officer in uniform has a sign above him that says, "Shoot me first." If you allow teachers and staff to be able to carry, you actually make the job of the police officer much safer, because the attacker then has to worry that when he goes and attacks the police officer, who he knows has a gun, he has to worry that somebody behind him or to the side, somebody that he doesn't know which one might be able to go and stop him, may be able to go and have a gun to stop him at that point. So it makes it riskier for people to do the attacks and takes away the strategic advantages that these killers have. But you have to understand, I have to read the diaries and other things that these people put out, is they're smart individuals whose goal is to try to kill as many people as possible. And they know if they go and attack a place where victims are able to go and defend themselves, they're not going to be able to go and kill as many people as they can otherwise. They want to go to targets where they know victims are helpless and not going to be able to go and stop them. And then if there is one person who is able to stop him, he'll take him out first, or wait for that person to leave, or pick another target. So I want to do something, but I want to do something that matters. Most of these mass public shootings don't involve so-called assault weapons anyway. The most deadly shootings that occur are the ones where multiple weapons are involved, not particularly the type of weapon that's used, but that they have multiple guns with them when they go and do the attack. And so, they want to go and do things like ban large capacity magazines or what have you. You kind of wonder whether these people have actually studied these attacks. But I'll mention one other thing. The most common gun control law by far that gets pushed after these mass public shootings is this rule for universal background checks, these background checks on the private transfers of guns. Even if such a law had been in effect nationally, and even it had been perfectly enforced, it would not have stopped one single mass public shooting this century. When Obama was president, or even under Biden now, or other times, the number one go-to type regulation the gun control advocates keep on pushing is these background checks on private transfers. So again, I want to do something. You know this. You and I have talked about this for decades. But I want to do something that actually matters. I think they have other reasons for pushing the types of gun control laws, unfortunately, that they're doing that they wrap up in these horrible tragedies.
As to assault weapons that Reid was talking about, meaning fully automatic weapons, John, aren't they already heavily restricted?
Look, you go and watch entertainment television. Last season, if you look at the police crime shows on ABC, NBC, CBS, Fox, about 80% of the guns used by criminals were machine guns. So you'd think virtually Hawaii is awash with machine guns. When you watch things like, Magnum PI or something. In the United States, since the 1930s, there's one case where somebody's been murdered with a machine gun in the United States. One case, okay? Not, getting this image from TV that it's 80% or something like that. There hasn't been one mass public shooting involving a machine gun. What's involved are semi-automatic guns. One pull the trigger, one bullet comes out, it reloads itself, one pull the trigger, one bullet comes out. And that's the type of gun that the Biden assault weapon, or the 1994 assault weapons ban dealt with. And that's what they're talking about. And Biden most recently, just a couple weeks ago in New York, was talking about banning basically any semi-automatic gun that could go and hold a magazine that could hold more than 10 rounds, which basically is the vast majority of guns owned in the United States. The thing that people don't understand, so if I have a rifle that's not a semi-automatic, so it's one, let's say a bolt action rifle, somebody has to manually put another bullet in the chamber after each round. If I have to fire multiple shots, or I have multiple criminals attacking me, civilians benefit from being able to go and have a semi-automatic gun, because they may not have the luxury of time to manually reload their gun to be able to go and defend themselves. That type of discussion is never involved in these types of issues that are there. Now, maybe Biden doesn't understand how guns operate, okay, which is a little bit of a concern given how much he goes and talks about gun control constantly. If you take him literally at what he's saying in these discussions, the types of bans that he wants to have would ban the vast majority of guns. 85% of handguns sold in the United States are semi-automatic guns.
Mass shootings, school shootings, John, in the last 20 or 30 years, they aren't really even up in America, are they?
Over most of the time, it's been very flat. There was a couple year period of time, like in 2017 or so, when it went up, but it kind of came back down when the pandemic hit. And, over time, it's hard to see much of an overall pattern that has been occurring.
John, I notice whenever there's a school shooting, whenever there's a so-called mass shooting, they never, ever, ever talk about how often guns are used for defensive purposes. In other words, even on Fox, I don't hear much discussion about how many lives have been saved because a good guy was able to get a gun, often just brandishing it, as you point out, to break off an attack, and an attack that might have caused serious bodily injury, if not death. How many Americans every year, John, use guns for defensive purposes?
Well, I mean, our best guess is something around 2 million times a year. Unfortunately, the media relies on places like the Gun Violence Archive, where they go and they say, well, there's only 2,000 defensive gun uses that get reported in the media. And so therefore, that means, there's only 2,000 defensive gun uses that occur in the United States. It's just an absurd statement. As you're indicating a minute ago, about 95% of the time that people use guns defensively, simply brandishing a gun is sufficient to go and cause a criminal to stop an attack. Less than 1% of the time that people use guns defensively, well less than 1%, are the attackers killed or injured. And yet if you go and look at those media stories, what you'll find is that most of them involve cases where the attacker's been killed. About 42% of the cases in news stories involve cases where the attacker's been wounded, usually seriously wounded. And only 4% of the news stories involve cases where brandishing occurred. And even most of those are somewhat unusual in that they involve cases where the gun was brandished and then the criminal was held at gunpoint until the police arrived. You don't need a conspiracy story to understand that if you're editor of a news bureau and you have two stories in front of you, in one case, there's a dead body on the ground. In another case, let's say a woman's brandished a gun, the would-be attackers run away, no shots are fired, no crime actually committed. You're not even sure what crime would have been committed. Which one of those two stories are going to be more newsworthy? You or I would all agree that the first story of a dead body on the ground is more newsworthy. That's what gets the coverage. But just because something's newsworthy doesn't mean it reflects reality in the percentages of things that are reported. And, if we care about policy, we care about not just what's newsworthy, but we care about everything that saves lives. We care about the brandishings as well as the cases where guns are used to actually go and kill people. But, the beginning of your question was focusing on mass shootings. And at the Crime Prevention Research Center, we've been collecting cases where police have said that what otherwise would have been a mass public shooting was stopped by law-abiding citizens with permitted concealed handguns. And there are dozens of these cases over the last few years, but they just don't get national news coverage. In the few cases where they do, the media completely mucks up the story. Let me give you examples of both types. You may remember the Pulse nightclub shooting a few years ago. At the time, it was the worst mass public shooting in the United States. And you had 49 people killed near Orlando, Florida. You probably don't know, though, a week later, there was a similar attack that occurred at a nightclub in South Carolina. The attacker there had shot 3 people. He was shooting at a 4th person when a person with a permitted concealed handgun pulled it out and shot the attacker there, seriously wounding him and ending the attack. The attacker had over 100 bullets on him still when the attack was stopped. But what the difference between the two cases was Florida is one of 10 states that bans people with permitted concealed handguns carrying them in establishments that get more than 50% of their revenue from alcohol. South Carolina is one of 40 states that allow people to be able to go and carry. Or take the Parkland shooting. You probably don't know that just a few months after that, there was an event at an elementary school not very far from Parkland, at a park right next to the school. You had hundreds of school children, you had their parents, you had teachers and staff. A man came up, started firing his gun, attacking the students that were there. Fortunately, there was a vendor right next to the park who had a permanent concealed handgun and was able to seriously wound the attacker before he was able to go and kill or wound other people. Well, again, the only media coverage of that was local media near where the attack occurred. In both of those cases, if those people with guns hadn't been there to stop it, it would have gotten massive international news coverage. But yet, they got no national news coverage and no international coverage. And so it really affects people's perceptions about the costs and benefits of guns. I'll give you one other example that kind of goes the other way. You remember the synagogue shooting in Pittsburgh. Just a few days after that, there was an attack at a Kroger grocery store in Louisville, Kentucky. A man had gone into the grocery store and was shooting blacks. And this got some national news coverage. Got on NBC, Meet the Press, New York Times, some others covered it. They ran with the quote from the attackers when he was walking by one of the customers there saying, "Whites don't shoot whites." Apparently telling the customer that he had nothing to worry about since they were both whites. The problem is the news coverage left out the full quote. But the full quote of the attacker was, "Please don't shoot me. Whites don't shoot whites." The customer there had a permanent concealed handgun and was pointing his gun at the attacker. And the attacker, rather than assuring the customer that the customer had nothing to worry about, the murderer there was begging the customer not to shoot the murderer. They ended up exchanging gunfire. The murderer was seriously wounded. He got into his car, drove off, drove a little ways down the road, passed out from his wound, and that's where the police arrested him. On Meet the Press, they spent like 4.5 minutes on the segment. And I wrote Chuck Todd. He and I, at that time, were able to text back and forth with each other. And I said, Chuck, here's some local media from Louisville that have the full quote, and I think it may change the type of reporting that you just did here. It makes the story more complicated. Here you have a white coming to the aid of blacks there to go and protect them, even though he was just assured that he had nothing to worry about because he was also white. And so it made the story more complicated. Sure, you have this horrible racist there, but you also had somebody, a white, who was willing to come to go and try to stop the attacks there and risk his own life in a gunfire exchange with the attacker. Anyway, even though Chuck and I had had some exchanges before that, he cut me off at that point, and we haven't had any exchanges since then. But that's just an example. I give you other similar examples, but I think I've talked enough on it.
Beto O'Rourke is running again for governor of Texas, John. Here's what he once said about taking away your AR-15s.
Hell yes, we're going to take your AR-15, your AK-47. We're not going to allow it to be used against our fellow Americans anymore.
He now says he's no longer going to take away your AR-15s. John, in your opinion, what happened?
Well, now he's telling everybody that he's a big defender of their Second Amendment rights. It's not just that they have nothing to worry about with he taking away people's guns, but he also wants to assure them that he is there to defend. That was the next part of his sentence there, that he's there to go and defend people's Second Amendment rights. So, my guess is, except for the Houston Chronicle, most people are very skeptical of his reversal there, that they are believe that once he gets into office, he's going to flip back and go back to the types of statements that he was making before. I mean, he claims now that it was just in the heat of the moment in that debate. But, there's a little problem with that, in that he said it multiple times, not just in that debate, making very similar types of comments where he refused to walk back the statement that's there. And, people can judge for themselves, but I suspect most people believe that those outbursts about how, hell yes, he's going to take away these semi-automatic rifles that people have, represent his true feelings on it. And that gets back to the earlier discussion that you and I had about the types of guns that they want to go and ban.
Indeed, Beto O'Rourke has said it numerous times.
Are you, in fact, in favor of gun confiscation?
Yes.
You're going to take care of the gun problem with me. You're going to be the one that leads this effort. I'm counting on you.
If we're able to pass mandatory buybacks and I'm able to sign that into law, then I fully expect our fellow Americans to turn in their AR-15s and their AK-47s. For anyone who does not and is caught in possession or seen in possession of one of these weapons of war, one of these instruments of terror, that weapon will be taken from them.
The most effective gun control measures have been gun licenses and mandatory buyback programs like they did in Australia. Would you be open to those proposals as president?
Yes, and I'm open to them right now as a candidate.
How will you get people to voluntarily turn them in?
It will not be a voluntary program, to be clear. It'll be a mandatory buyback program.
Congressman,
to
let me
respect
follow up.
and follow the law.
Just to follow up, your expectations aside, your website says you will find people who don't give up their weapons. That doesn't take those weapons off the street. So to be clear, exactly how are you going to take away weapons from people who do not want to give them up and you don't know where they are?
If someone does not turn in an AR-15 or an AK-47, one of these weapons of war, or brings it out in public and brandishes it in an attempt to intimidate, as we saw when we were at Kent State recently, then that weapon will be taken from them.
John, my final question. You've said throughout this interview that you want to do things that work. What things will work to reduce gun crime?
Well, the same things that reduce violent crime generally. Higher arrest rates, higher conviction rates, longer prison sentences, undoing this crazy bail reform that they have. You want to make it costly and risky for criminals to go and harm other people. And the thing that gets lost in this is, who are the victims of these violent crimes? Biden and the Democrats claim that they care about blacks and Hispanics. The vast majority of crimes are committed against blacks. When you're seeing this increase in crime that's occurring, what parts of town do they think that most of these crimes are occurring? They're occurring in relatively heavily black and Hispanic areas. But it's not just the direct victims of crime. Many of the businesses in those areas are owned by blacks and Hispanics. The people who work predominantly in those stores, whose jobs are being destroyed, are blacks and Hispanics. The people who shop in those stores are blacks and Hispanics. The people who own houses in those areas, whose property values are being destroyed by the higher crime that's occurring there, are blacks and Hispanics. So, if you want to go and fix this problem and try to reduce all this damage that's occurring, you just can't go and worry about the criminal here who's committing crimes against these poor minority areas that are there. You have to make it risky for those people to go and commit crimes, to go and be sympathetic to the people who, in many different ways, are the victims of these crimes that are occurring. As I said, I kind of wish Biden's given at least 4 major addresses focusing on violent crime. And if you go through the speeches, virtually all, the entire speeches focus on gun crime and laws that he wants to have. The thing is, the types of rules that he wants to have there are actually not even going to solve that problem. So take his talk that he gave in New York City. What was his number one proposal for dealing with violent crime? It was to go after what he called rogue gun dealers, people that are supposedly selling guns out of the back of their stores to criminals without doing background checks. That's not what's happening. And that's not what his rules have anything to do with. What he wants is a zero tolerance policy. When there's any paperwork mistake that occurs, no matter how trivial, no matter how inconsequential to a crime being committed, he wants to put them out of business. So, let me ask you, with the Epoch Times or your radio show, do you think if somebody were to go and look at the last 15 years of paperwork, that they could find some tiny paperwork mistake in all the paperwork that you've done? Should we go and have it so that your license or whatever is taken away and you're not able to do it? What do you think would happen to the number of radio stations or others in this country if we had that type of rule for them? It's just a crazy thing that he wants to have. He wants to double the budget for the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, Firearms, and Explosives so they can go and fully implement this zero tolerance policy. What it's going to do is it's just going to drive a large number of gun dealers out of business, and it's going to make it more difficult, more costly for law-abiding citizens to be able to own guns. And who is that mainly going to affect? That's mainly going to affect the poor, the very people that my research that you've known over the decades has consistently shown are the ones who benefit the most from having the option to be able to go and protect themselves. Anybody who's read my academic research knows that I think police are the single most important factor for reducing crime. But the police themselves know that they virtually always arrive on the crime scene after the crimes occurred. And that raises the question about what people should do when they're having to confront a criminal by themselves. And having a gun is by far the safest course of action. And there's two groups of people who benefit the most from that. One, people who are most likely victims of violent crime. It'd be great if the police were there all the time to protect them, but they're not. So you're mainly talking about poor blacks who live in high crime urban areas. The other group of people who benefit the most are those who are relatively weaker physically, women and the elderly. You're almost always talking about young males doing the attacks. And when a man attacks a woman, there's a larger strength difference that exists there than when a man is attacking another man. And the presence of a gun represents a much bigger relative change in a woman's ability to go and defend herself than it does for a man. So, the way I look at it is the most vulnerable people in our society are the ones who benefit most from having the option to be able to go and protect themselves. And the types of rules that Biden wants to have will make that impossible. You live in Los Angeles. A few years ago, I was able to go and get the list of all the concealed carry permit holders in Los Angeles County. There was a little bit over 300 concealed carry permit holders out of an adult population of like 8 million people. But you could go through and check who got it. Nationwide, about 28% of permit holders are women. In Los Angeles County, it's 7%. Nationwide, over 12% of permit holders are Black, essentially mirroring their share of the adult population nationwide. In Los Angeles County, it's 5% of the permit holders are Black. That's less than half their share of the population in the county. In Los Angeles County, 54% of the population is Hispanic. Only 6.5% of the permit holders in Los Angeles County are Hispanic. Now, is it just that in Los Angeles County, women aren't being stopped, that they're not being threatened with violent crime like they are in the rest of the country? Is it that Blacks in Watts or other places in Los Angeles aren't being threatened with crime as they are in the rest of the country? No, that's absurd and ridiculous. The types of people Democrats who are running the system and who are the ones who are in charge of whether or not they deem somebody having a good reason for being able to go and have a gun to protect themselves. These Democrats overwhelmingly give permits to wealthy, politically connected white males and to some extent Asian males. But, and that's fine. I'm glad wealthy, powerful, politically connected people who give donations to the sheriff's reelection campaign are able to go and protect themselves. But they're not the ones who need it the most. They're not the ones who are most likely victims of violent crime. And they're not the ones who benefit the most from being able to go and protect themselves. So to answer your question, there are two things that can be done. One is let law enforcement do its job. The second thing is stop making it so difficult for the most vulnerable people in our society to be able to go and protect themselves.
John, I would add a third thing. Let's have a discussion about family breakdown and the number of kids who enter the world without a father married to the mother. There's a huge connection between growing up without a father and crime and gun crime.
No, I couldn't agree with you more. I've actually done a significant amount of research on that. And I think there's a huge amount of academic work that indicates that single parent families, children growing up in single parent families, are much more likely to do poorly in school. They're much more likely to get involved in crime. There's a huge amount of work that's been done on this. And one of the things, this is maybe getting into another discussion, that people talk about the relationship between abortion and crime. My academic research indicates that the liberalization of abortion rules, abortion was never banned, but the liberalization of abortion rules actually resulted in a huge increase in single-parent families and actually increased crime. And, if you want to talk about that, I'm happy to go into it. But I couldn't agree with you more.
John Lott, founder, president, Crime Prevention Research Center. John, as always, thank you for your time.
Thank you very much, Larry. It's great to talk to you. Thanks for being there.